Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Mills, and I'm a research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at the Berkeley Lab. I'll be the moderator for the presentation today. Just so you know, everyone is in listen-only mode for today's webinar. We've planned about 45 minutes of material, and that means that we'll leave about 15 minutes or so at the end for questions. If you do have questions today, we have a Q&A function that you can use in the Zoom windows that you can see there. Please do submit your questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll try to get to those throughout the Q&A session at the end. There is a chat function also. If you have any technical issues, you can use that, but let's keep all of the questions to that Q&A function if you can. If we don't get to your questions at the end, we will try to follow up with email. We know that some of you are not able to use the Zoom webinar functions. And so if that's the case and you do have questions, you can submit them directly to me also. My email is admills@lbl.gov. And you can see my contact info also on the last slide. I'm going to put the project website where the slides are available into the chat function. And folks have already seen that also in the email announcement with this. We'll use that same project website to post a recording of this webinar afterwards, so you can have a look at that or share it with any colleagues that weren't able to make it. And again, these slides are online for anybody to see. So today we'll be having two speakers. These are two of the report authors. We have Jo Seal, who is a senior scientific engineering associate and who led this work. We also have Cody Warner, who's a graduate student research assistant and also a PhD student in the Energy and Resources group at UC Berkeley. So thank you again and welcome everybody, and I'll leave it to Jo there.
Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share with you some of our research results. We want to investigate today together the impacts of high wind and solar futures on decision-making in the electricity sector and look in particular at demand-side effects. Before doing so, I want to thank the entire research team. So that is Andrew Mills and Cody Warner, but also Bentham Paulus and Ryan Weiser here at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I want to thank the United States Department of Energy for funding this work, in particular the Strategic Programs Office at the EERE office. However, all the positions and statements that are going to be voiced here today do not reflect overall DOE policy, but merely our Berkeley Lab research results. And finally, I want to thank the Technical Assistance Committee that has accompanied us during the research and provided invaluable feedback. So, to start with a brief overview of the research. We know that traditionally many long-lasting decisions that are made in the electricity sector are based on historical observations or assumptions about a future that looks pretty much business as usual. However, we also know that growing shares of wind and solar, or what we will call variable renewable energy, or VRE, will change fundamental characteristics of the power systems at large. And so the objective of this research is to inform decision makers, such as you, about the impact of these high VRE or wind and solar penetrations and how that affects the cost effectiveness of certain long-lasting decisions that are done in the electricity sector. In order to do so, we leverage several wholesale market simulation tools in order to estimate wholesale prices for energy products, capacity products, and ancillary services. That was actually a research project all on its own. We published that 2 years ago. It is available on our homepage, where you can see a full technical report or a briefing deck similar to the one that we've made for today, and also actually the underlying data if you want to play a little bit with that yourself. So we use these hourly wholesale electricity price series to then analyze implications of changes in prices on demand-side resources. And in particular, we want to highlight how program design or investment decisions would be meaningfully different if we are in a high VRE environment versus just a low VRE environment. We will look at 3 examples today during this webinar. On the one hand, we will look at how the timing changes of peak system needs And energy efficiency has traditionally been a resource to address these peak system needs at times. And so we want to see how changes to those peak system times will affect the valuation of energy efficiency. And then on the other hand, of the other side of the spectrum, we will look at times when we have excess electricity or very low electricity prices and what opportunities that may present to some very large electricity consumers and other emerging applications. And finally, we want to look at retail rates as a mechanism or a vehicle to translate between the changes that we see in the wholesale electricity markets and communicate those price changes to final end consumers to unlock additional demand side flexibility or allow them to make use of new, very low cost resources. I now advance as well to slide 3 for those that are not following us on the webinar. Now, in general, we know that demand side programs and decisions about them or investments on demand side in the electric sector are quite complex and can incorporate many different considerations. They may span particular policy or regulatory objectives or include equity considerations, but they often have some form of economic efficiency evaluation as well. And cost effectiveness tests are often used to inform these economic efficiency decisions. And changes in the overall power system dynamics can affect value propositions of some of these demand-side assets, and in turn can affect their cost effectiveness. And so we want to leverage our wholesale electricity price series as a proxy for marginal system value, and then see how growing levels of wind and solar change that marginal system value of various resources and what implications that then has about final investment decisions. The next slide is quite busy, a little complicated. It is a summary of the entire year 1 research. So I will not have time to go into detail here. You can look at the full technical report if you are interested in learning more about it. But what we did was we looked at the year 2030, so only 10 years from now, and compared one scenario where we froze the wind and solar shares as they existed in the year 2016 and contrasted those with 3 high VRE scenarios. One that had a lot of wind, one that had a lot of solar, and one that was balanced with equal amounts of wind and solar. We looked at 4 different regions in the United States: the Southwest Power Pool, NYISO, an organized market in New York, CAISO in California, and ERCOT in Texas. And while some of our findings varied quite a bit, depending on whether you're in a high solar or a high wind scenario, certain elements were similar in all 3 high VRE scenarios. On the one hand, we found that the average prices over the course of an entire year decrease with increasing renewable energy penetration, up to 40% in some instances. We also found that there is an increased frequency in those hours that have especially low electricity prices, under $5 or even $0. This was particularly true in ERCOT in Texas in the high solar scenario. ERCOT is a system that does not have a lot of transmission capacity to neighboring balancing authorities, and so was less able to ship some of that excess solar generation during the middle of the day, which led to additional price collapses in the middle of the day there. We also found many changes in diurnal price profiles between our different VRE scenarios. You may be quite familiar with the duck curve, which kind of collapses, has a price collapse in the middle of the day as solar generation is there, and then towards the evening, prices resume again to higher levels. Again, ERCOT is a little interesting here because they have the scarcity pricing mechanisms where prices can actually increase way above traditional low VRE levels in the evenings if one hits scarcity moments. We also found that with increasing VRE penetrations, prices become more variable and volatile, and in particular, the timing of the top net load hours shifts. That is important for capacity value calculations, and we see that the top net load hours shift from the early afternoon to the early evening. So With our analysis, we really want to focus on broad directional changes that policymakers should consider, and we do not really aim to have a full replication of total cost effectiveness tests. There are a couple of limitations in our analysis. So, for example, we do not have a comprehensive analysis of all possible value streams. Instead, we only limit ourselves to energy values, capacity values, and in some instances to environmental costs as well. So, for example, in New York and in California, we include a carbon price, but not in SPP and in ERCOT. One other thing that I just briefly want to mention is while we do assume some storage penetration, we only do so up to the levels mandated by storage mandates in NISO and in CAISO, but do not assume a full cost-effective storage penetration. So that may mediate some of the pricing dynamics that we otherwise may see. We also only do a marginal value assessment, so we do not assess market depth, and we do not see how demand may change in response to this new pricing dynamics and how that changed demand in turn may change prices again. We only have a limited number of scenarios that we investigate, only 3 high VRE scenarios, and we only look at 1 year, the year 2030, which may not be necessarily representative of the overall longer-term electric sector evolution. But the overall idea of this research is really just to get your thoughts going. How may value propositions change in a higher VRE future of 40 to 50% over the next 10 years or so? And it's not meant to be particularly prescriptive. It's just a way to kind of get the conversation started. And with that, I'd like to start our first analysis. So I'm now going to slide 6 and then 7, looking at energy efficiency. So there are many energy efficiency programs around the country, and administrators of energy efficiency programs are usually tasked to find a selection of suitable measures or combinations of energy efficiency measures. And these portfolios have a variety of goals. They may need to decrease overall energy consumption or curb future demand growth, or may meet explicit EE resource standards. But they also are meant to reduce overall electric system needs and costs, and that is where our cost effectiveness and economic efficiency analysis comes in. So we know that with the changing energy supply options, meaning more wind and solar, we will have changing peak and off-peak periods, and that in turn will change the composition of an optimal or best energy efficiency portfolio. And that is what we now want to look at over the next few slides. So slide 8 highlights our analytical approach and methods. Overall, we approximate the value of these energy efficiency measures by a simple product of hourly time-varying wholesale electricity prices and an hourly load shape or EE saving shapes. Unfortunately, it's quite difficult to actually get good empirical, robust data for energy efficiency saving shapes that have a high time and geographic resolution. So what we did instead was to use high resolution load shape of 8,760 hours per year and assume that the shape of the load is similar to the saving shape that one may unlock with an energy efficiency investment. There's actually quite a bit of research that is being done here at Berkeley Lab that tries to assemble a bigger database of better energy efficiency saving shapes. Unfortunately, we were not yet able to use that for this analysis. Also important is that we normalized the energy efficiency saving shapes to just 1 megawatt hour per year, regardless of the actual depth of energy efficiency savings for one particular appliance. That allows us to more easily compare and contrast value changes for either one measure versus other measures or the performance of a measure in different parts of the country. We look at a couple of different measures. Here on the right side, I've shown some that we assume to be relatively constant throughout the country that do not vary by location. So we have residential refrigerator loads, dishwasher loads, clothes washer shapes, and residential lighting and commercial lighting shapes that we used from the California database on energy efficiency resources and the Build America simulations. Then we have some other energy efficiency measures that actually vary quite a bit depending on where you are in the country. And this is particularly true for HVAC loads that are driven by climatic differences. And so for each ISO, we use two candidate locations. In SPP, we are looking at Kansas City and Sioux Falls. In NISO, we look at Buffalo and New York City. CAISO, we look at Bakersfield and San Francisco. And for ERCOT, we look at Dallas and El Paso. Now we know actually that El Paso is not part of ERCOT formally, but it is a nice representation of the climate system in the western parts of ERCOT, and thus we use it here. So these are the underlying load shapes, which we assume to be EE's saving shapes, and we will now combine them with the concurrent hourly energy and capacity values in order to then calculate the total energy efficiency value and see how those values change over the course of the year and between the different scenarios. So slide number 10 now has a summary of that. This is quite a bit of a busy graph, so I want to orient you a little bit. We have our 4 ISOs, and then in the lines are the different measures. The x-axis is the total value in dollars per megawatt hour, so energy and capacity value. And the red triangle represents the energy and capacity value in the low VRE scenario for a given measure in a given region. Now what you notice is that the other 3 dots, the yellow square that represents the high solar scenario, or the blue X that represents the high wind scenario, are often to the left of the red triangle, meaning that there is a decline in the total value of energy efficiency savings as defined by only energy and capacity value. So the total value declines, and that is actually strongly driven by a decline in the energy value component. Capacity value at times may even increase a little bit, but the energy value decreases are so large that the total value decline is, or the total value change is negative. You will also notice that the magnitude of the value decline differs between both measures and regions. The value decline is the strongest in CAISO and in ERCOT, and there are some applications that see very little value change, for example, a residential dishwasher. And there are some others that see very big value declines, for example, commercial lighting in the high solar scenarios, where energy savings that occur during the middle of the day when electricity becomes relatively cheap because of high solar generation levels doesn't become as valuable anymore. There are some others, however, where the value actually increase. And I want to point out an example that I've circled with a green bubble here in ERCOT, where residential lighting investments for energy efficiency, so switch to LEDs, for example, actually become more valuable. And that is driven by the increase in some of these scarcity price events that we see in the early evening in some of our high VRE penetration scenarios. So we see changes in the total value, often to the negative, for energy efficiency. What we also want to do is look at the relative ranking of energy efficiency measures. In order to do that, we have ranked each measure in a particular scenario from the most valuable number 1 to the least valuable position number 9. And that is on the very left side in the low VRE scenario, and on the right side we go all the way to the high solar scenario. Now you see that some measures remain fairly stable. Residential HVAC investments, for example, perform really well in all of our scenarios. However, there are some, again, the example of commercial HVAC or commercial lighting, that are kind of middle of the road measures in the low VRE scenario that become much less valuable and fall in the ranking to the latter spots. And some other measures that used to be not valuable or the least valuable, such as residential lighting, that get propelled to the second largest value spot, or the spot with the second largest value in the high solar scenarios. So just to emphasize again, there are changes in the total value, in the relative ranking of these different measures. The performance differs in the high wind and in the high solar scenario, given the different price dynamics that we observe. And one last thing that I want to draw your attention to here is that in CAISO, we actually do not see a lot of shifts in the relative ranking of some of these measures. And we believe that is due to the fact that already in the low VRE penetration scenario in CAISO, we have quite a high solar penetration. In 2016, we just had a lot of solar already in CAISO. And so even though you may think that in your particular region, you may not hit a 30% solar penetration or so over the next 10 years, even if you just maybe get up to 10% or so, that might already be enough to trigger some of this value reshuffling that we observe here. So just something to take forward. And with that, I want to conclude the brief example on energy efficiency, and now want to look at opportunities for large energy consumers and what happens during the many hours of the year which now have lower electricity prices. So energy-intensive industries can benefit from the changing energy price dynamics that some of the high VRE futures may offer if they are able to access some of these new wholesale electricity prices. They can then profit from periods with very low or maybe even negatively priced electricity. For our analysis, we compare the performance in the different scenarios by looking at a product's levelized unit cost. That is kind of our metric of comparison that we will use going forward. And the levelized unit costs include two major components. On the one hand, it has upfront capital costs, and then it has operating costs. And we will evaluate opportunities for increased technical flexibility. So that means whether or not you are able to ramp up or down your energy demand due to process changes, and your financial flexibility as well. So whether or not you are able to shift between a low capex process that has high OpEx costs, or vice versa, something where you need to invest a lot in capex upfront, but then have low ongoing energy costs. We have in the full report many examples. I want to highlight three in particular. Due to time constraints, we will only be able to talk about the first one here in today's webinar, where we will look at changes in the optimal utilization rates. So Cody will talk about that in just a minute, but we will look here at hydrogen production and then later on branch out to other electro-commodities. So I will not speak too much about that right now. But what we do in the report is that we also look at whether and to what extent product storage investments may enable higher production outputs at time of low prices, and then you store either the final or some kind of intermediate product for a while to effectively decouple your final product delivery from instantaneous electricity price dynamics. And we look at an example in the report at a desalination project in Texas. And then we also investigate what opportunities are there for supplementary production processes that enable fuel switching. So for example, you may have a district energy system that historically has relied on gas boilers, but you supplement that now with industrial scale heat pumps that can leverage cheap and abundant electricity at times of high VRE penetrations. But if electricity prices go up, you may then again switch to the traditional gas boiler. So unfortunately, we won't be able to talk about that much here today, but I invite you to look at the report for more information. And with that, I want to now hand it over to Cody to talk us through the next set of examples.
All right, thank you, Yo, for, can we move on to the slide 14 for those who are following along on the phone? Thanks for highlighting some of the margins in which VRE price dynamics can affect decisions made by large energy consumers. Like Yo said, I'm going to talk in more detail about one of these margins, which is the opportunity for frequent periods of low electricity prices to affect how an end user trades off capital costs against operating costs. And so to address this first decision, we present a case study of powered hydrogen, which is currently a niche application due to high costs. I'll note that while we study powered hydrogen specifically, we also generalize our results to other industrial commodities that require significant amounts of electricity, And those examples, could include carbon fiber or desalinated water. And so what exactly do I mean by power to hydrogen? I suspect some of you may be familiar with the term, and it's an energy-intensive process in which an electric current is used to separate oxygen and hydrogen from water. The hydrogen gas can then be used on its own as a fuel, or it can be used downstream in ammonia or fertilizer production, or it can be used to create synthetic natural gas, or just really used in a variety of applications. And so it's important to note that today, hydrogen production is a significant source of global natural gas demand. And below, you can see some of the key assumptions we use in modeling a centralized hydrogen plant, which we mostly borrow from NREL's hydrogen production cost analysis case studies. And I'll point out that we're just going to estimate, when we're talking about levelized cost, we're just talking about the levelized cost of producing the hydrogen under our different VRE scenarios. We're not going to estimate the cost of compressing the hydrogen gas and also distributing it to customers. All right, next, now we're moving on to slide 15. And so our first result is that low-priced electricity from high penetrations of VRE can reduce the cost of producing hydrogen via electrolysis by about 13 to 40%. You can see in that left bar chart that the levelized cost falls in the VRE scenarios compared to the red low VRE scenario. And you may also notice that in these bar charts, the shares of capital and OpEx costs change in composition between the low and high VRE scenarios. And this is most clearly seen in the CAISO chart in the lower left, where the share of capital costs increases and the share of operating costs decreases. It may not be obvious why these periods of low cost electricity cause this change in composition. And so on the right, if you look, we're now plotting levelized cost on the y-axis as a function of how many hours you might operate the electrolyzer per year. And you can see that these levelized cost curves not only shift down with high VRE penetration, but they also bend modestly in shape, which causes their minimum points, which are indicated by those vertical dashed lines, to occur at lower utilization rates. And so these lower utilization rates are really the reason why we see operating costs decrease as a share of total cost and capital costs increase in their contribution. And so I think an interesting takeaway here is that we see VRE price dynamics causing hydrogen producers to favor low capital cost technologies that are able to flexibly switch on and off. And now to slide 16. And so now, when we think about electrolyzers, they may be able to switch on and off quickly within 30 minutes to respond to low electricity prices, but other production processes may be constrained by long startup times or other operational constraints. And so on the left here, we're comparing an unconstrained levelized cost curve in gray to the yellow levelized cost curve for a production process that may require, to be dispatched in 24-hour increments. And so you can imagine that the constrained process doesn't have the same opportunity to flexibly turn on and off and minimize its cost over a select number of low-priced hours. And so that would lead to both the higher levelized cost and the greater utilization rate we see on that left chart. And so now also on the right, we plot the percent cost increase as the duration of a batch constraint increases. And you can see how the batch constraint has a stronger impact on costs in the high VRE scenarios, where in the low VRE scenario, the batch constraint is mostly negligible. Moving on to the next slide here. And so while in the previous slide, we abstracted to an electro-commodity that might have different requirements for run times, now we're looking at, on this slide, how our results might change if we vary the upfront capital cost or the efficiency of a production process. And so this chart is a little complicated, but on the x-axis, we're looking at the upfront capital cost of the electro-commodity process, and then the upper and lower bounds of these red and green areas represent changes in the efficiency of the production process. And what you can see here is that at high capital costs on kind of the far right end of these charts, really these red and green areas overlap quite a bit. And what that really means is that there aren't many differences in levelized costs between these high and low VRE futures. However, on the left end of the charts at low capital costs, you see these red and green areas begin to diverge a bit. And so we can interpret the steeper gradient of the green area as representing that capital cost improvements yield greater cost reductions in a high VRE future. And the narrowing of kind of that upper and lower bound can be interpreted as efficiency improvements decreasing in their ability to reduce levelized costs. And really, if you look at the red low VRE scenario, you don't see the same kind of steepening and narrowing of the area chart at low capital costs. And so one of the conclusions we can draw here is that the decisions of capital intensive industries may not really be that sensitive to different future VRE penetrations. But low capital cost industries may want to prioritize further capital cost reductions over improvements in process efficiency. All right, moving on to the next section, retail rate design. Now we're going to transition to our third long-lasting decisions in the electricity sector, retail rate design. Okay, so in this context, we're going to ask, under different high VRE futures, how might regulated retail electricity rates further diverge from marginal cost and lead to market inefficiencies? And also, what new aspects should retail rate designers consider when drafting the next generation of rates? And it's important to distinguish, as many of you know, that retail rate designers don't only think about electricity rates that are the most economically efficient. They also consider other worthy design principles like fairness, equity, simplicity, or customer acceptance of rates. And so really you can think of a rate design in terms of trade-offs between economic efficiency and other principles like simplicity. And so a flat rate that provides the same rate per kilowatt at all hours of the day might be really easy for a customer to understand and accept, but it might do a poor job of communicating the real-time constraints of the electric power system. And so on the other end of the spectrum are rates like time of use rates or real-time pricing, which are better approximations of system costs, but might be harder for customers to understand. And so really our analysis of retail rate design is going to investigate how this trade-off between simple rate structures and more complex rate structures could be more important in high VRE futures. Moving to the next slide. So our approach here is that we're going to start in a low VRE future and derive characteristics of rate structures that produce the lowest level of economic loss or deadweight loss. And then we're going to take the characteristics of these rate structures that are optimized for a low VRE future and see how they perform in a high VRE future. And we hypothesize that they won't do very well due to these kind of different VRE price dynamics. And then finally, in the third step, we'll re-optimize the rate structures for a high VRE future and make recommendations about rates that perform well or are efficient in high VRE futures. And so we're going to limit ourselves to just looking at 4 different rate structures here. In all 3 of these steps, we're going to look at a flat rate, and then we're also going to look at a time of use rate with 2 periods, and also a time of use rate with 3 periods. And then finally, we're going to also evaluate a critical peak pricing program that's combined with a 3-period time of use rate. Next slide. We are now on slide 21 for those who are following along on the phone. So just briefly, if we want to evaluate economic efficiency of these rate structures, we need some mechanism to quantify how efficient a rate structure is. If you recall in the previous section about large energy consumers, we were using levelized costs to compare different scenarios. Here we'll be using deadweight loss to compare rate structures between scenarios. And so on this left chart in gray, you see the wholesale price of electricity that's varying by the hour. And in red, you see a typical flat electricity rate that a customer might face. And so you can see that in some hours, that flat electricity rate charges a customer a price that is higher than the cost or lower than the cost to serve that customer. And so you can imagine that there might be some activity that a customer would engage in that generates legitimate value to him or her, like charging an electric vehicle, that the customer doesn't do so because the price they face is too high. And so we can go back to Econ 101 and quantify that lost value to the customer. And we call that lost value deadweight loss. And so deadweight loss is a function of how large the deviation in price signal is from the efficient price. And it's also a function of the slope of the customer's demand curve, which is determined by price elasticity. And so if customers are very sensitive to price changes, you'd expect to have a higher deadweight loss from these price deviations. And so just in general, throughout the rest of this section, I'll use deadweight loss interchangeably with economic inefficiency. Moving to the next slide. So first, as I mentioned in our first step, we're going to look at the characteristics of rate structures that minimize deadweight loss in a low VRE future. And so here in gray, we're looking at the average wholesale energy and capacity price in NISO during the summer months. And in red, we're looking at a 2-period time of use rate that minimizes deadweight loss. And so you can see that the peak period covers most of the day, beginning in the morning and ending later in the evening. And Con Ed's current time of use rate offered to residential customers features a very similar peak period that covers most of the day. And this is really an indication that the rates designed for a low VRE future mostly resemble the type of rates that we see offered today. Next slide. So now let's look at how much deadweight loss all 4 of our rate structures are associated with in a low VRE future. And so on the y-axis now, we have deadweight loss expressed as dollars per megawatt hour. And on the x-axis, moving from left to right, we have a flat rate to the critical peak pricing program, kind of similar to that order on the spectrum I showed in the intro slide. And as we'd expect, as we move left to right, deadweight loss decreases with greater differentiation or complexity of the rate structure. And so just for context, if we summed up the deadweight loss across all megawatt hours of the year, we estimate there would be roughly $2 billion in economic losses in ERCOT if all customers were on a flat electricity rate. But this is a very rough approximation. Next slide. And so now we estimate the deadweight loss associated with a flat rate, not just in a low VRE future, but also in high VRE futures. And you can see quite clearly that the flat rates feature higher economic losses in high VRE relative to low VRE scenarios. And the main reason, you might expect that flat rates cannot capture the increased price volatility associated with higher penetration of renewables. And I'll point out that this efficiency might be tolerated, this inefficiency might be tolerated in a low VRE future, but perhaps not in a high VRE future as the magnitude of the loss increases. And I'll also note, like Yo had mentioned in the energy efficiency section, but the losses are somewhat negligible in CAISO because CAISO's low VRE future already has significant VRE penetration associated with it. Next slide. And so now it might be obvious to many of you that, of course, flat rates will perform worse in high VRE futures, but it's also the case that that more complex rates, like time of use rates, will need reform in high VRE futures as well. And so here we are plotting the optimal low VRE time of use rate overlaid against high VRE wholesale energy and capacity prices. And so recall in NISO, the 2-period time of use rate featured a long, modest peak period. But now you can see that the peak period shifts later in the day and becomes more pronounced with higher VRE penetrations. And again, in CAISO, in the bottom left there, a lot of this peak shifting has already occurred in the low VRE future. Next slide. And so here we want to show that not updating more complex rate structures in high VRE futures will lead to greater economic losses than continued reliance on a flat rate. So it's really critical, I think, for everyone to understand that these complex rate structures, these time differentiated rate structures, are not immune to the changing VRE price dynamics. You see in NISO and ERCOT, failure to modify or update the peak period of time of use rates can lead to a 10 to 15 times increase in deadweight loss, particularly in the high solar future. Next slide. And so now, what modifications could be made to rates to maximize economic efficiency in high VRE futures? Well, one is greater use of 3-period time of use rates as opposed to 2-period rates, which are more common today. And so a 3-period time of use rate does a very good job of approximating the wholesale cost of electricity in a high solar future because the diurnal price profile is quite predictable. And so this 3-period time of use rate, for example, could allow EV owners or hydrogen producers to better align their demand side decisions with times of the day when renewable generation could be facing curtailment. There are also other recommendations we make that are highlighted in the report, such as expanding use of critical peak pricing days, and I encourage you to look at the report in more detail for that. Next slide. So now to wrap up this section, I want to emphasize that in a low VRE future, there may be only modest economic benefits from rolling out time differentiated rates versus flat rates. And the other advantages of flat rates, like simplicity and customer acceptance, may outweigh these modest economic improvements. However, in high VRE futures, the benefits of time differentiated rates are larger, indicated by that relatively steeper line between the flat and TOU rates on the chart shown there. And I'll conclude by saying that a critical peak pricing program combined with the 3-period time of use rate can eliminate almost 100% of the deadweight loss associated with a flat rate. And so while many folks advocate for full-blown retail real-time pricing, a well-designed 3-period time of use rate combined with critical peak pricing can cover quite a bit of ground. All right, now I'll turn it over to Yo to wrap up and summarize the conclusions from our study.
Yeah, thank you, Cody. We're now on slide 29. So just to kind of refresh some of the major conclusions that we had drawn in each of our 3 sections for these 3 representative demand side decisions. First, looking at energy efficiency and changes in value at times of peak demand, we found that using our forward-looking scenario analyses that use these highly time-dependent valuation approaches that use 8,760 hours per year's values can provide quite a number of insights about trade-offs between different resources, between the low VRE scenario and the high VRE scenario, but also between the high wind scenario and the high solar scenario. We've shown that the absolute values and the relative ranking of different energy efficiency measures will change with higher VRE penetrations, and that will likely trigger a change in the optimal portfolio of such energy efficiency measures. We showed that, especially in the high solar scenarios, we have very strong effects on average diurnal price profiles, and so some of the existing value differences may increase in magnitude as more solar comes online on the grid. We also showed that in the high VRE scenarios, residential energy efficiency upgrades that lower evening consumptions may deliver even bigger value in the future than office energy efficiency upgrades that provide primarily daytime savings. So in the pre-COVID time, if we're all in the office and use less electricity during the middle of the day, if that energy is not as valuable anymore, those EE upgrades are less valuable as well. So what does that mean? Maybe you should target residential energy efficiency upgrades in future program design. Now, there's a lot of future research possibilities in this realm. You may want to evaluate a broader set of measures or more robust energy efficiency saving shapes and not just our average load shapes. And you may want to consider additional value streams. As mentioned earlier, we did not look at the value of transmission and distribution costs, but only energy and capacity values. So that may shift some of our findings. Also, you may want to include actual measured costs in the analysis to really arrive at a full net benefit ranking and valuation, and not just the value side. Looking now at the opportunities for the very large energy consumers, we found that large consumers can benefit from the changing electricity price dynamics and the increased frequency of very low prices if they can access those wholesale electricity markets, and if they can substitute their electricity potentially for other energy inputs in their production processes. Those that benefit the most from these new low electricity price periods are those that have, on the one hand, very energy intensive processes, so that currently the energy costs are high, or those that can effectively decouple some of their commodity production from energy demand by increasing intermediate or final product storage, and the report has more examples about that, or those that can invest in the capability to strategically switch between different fuels and electricity depending on the relative pricing, and make use of electricity during periods of low electricity prices. So this, again, is an area ripe for future analysis. You may want to investigate how certain R&D investments that either reduce the capital cost of relevant equipment or that may yield higher process efficiencies compare with the actual costs that are associated with these R&D efforts. Or you may want to look a little closer what potential is out there to use electricity for high temperature processes in industry. You may want to see how you can change other industrial production schedules to increase the flexibility in the electricity consumption to become more responsive to more dynamic electricity price environments. And finally, you may want to further investigate how low VRE prices can affect the choices of location decisions about new production plant investments. So for example, maybe you want to go close to an electricity node that has a lot of wind, where there's currently a lot of wind curtailment and where the nodal electricity price is very low. Or you may want to investigate what kind of technology choices will change in a given industry and how electricity market dynamics may change in response to these different energy demand profiles once consumers become aware of the new electricity price dynamics. Finally, I want to conclude with the retail rate design. This is our vehicle to actually communicate effectively the changes in overall system value as measured by wholesale energy and capacity prices to the end consumer. And we've stipulated that aligning retail rates more closely with marginal costs can increase potentially overall demand responsiveness to the varying system needs, and that more dynamic retail electricity rates have lower economic losses than flat rates, and thus the relative benefit increases even more once we have more wind and solar on the system. So it is, you may want to deliberate more seriously about more complex rate structures. And we've shown that growing wind and solar shares change the definition of those peak and off-peak periods. And so that in turn can lead to even worse outcomes of malaligned time of use rates. And that it is important to repeatedly update your time of use periods and maybe even introduce a new super off-peak period for a high solar penetration futures. Future research might want to assess how various customer classes could respond then to these new price signals and how they can capture more economic value from these new rate designs. And you may as well want to consider impacts again of transmission and distribution costs and how they may be best included in retail rates. We again only focused here on energy and generation capacity costs. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention and to carve out some time to meet with us today. Unfortunately, we will not be able to meet at conferences or seminars or so over the next few months, but please do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have any thoughts or concerns or other ideas. Our phone numbers and emails are listed here. We invite you to download the full technical report at the URL that is listed there in the top right side. So that's the technical report. You have access to the slides here. We'll post the webinar here. And also there's a link to previous research that we've done that details those changes in wholesale electricity price dynamics with growing wind and solar shares. You can also sign up for emails if you want to be informed about new publication releases. So I thank you very much for your attention, and we'll now turn it over to Andrew. Maybe we have a couple of questions that we can now address in the Q&A.
Thanks, Yo. And we do have a lot of great questions that have come in, and hopefully we'll be able to get to a number of them. We might not be able to get to all of them, though. Just to start off, there were a couple questions that came in about some of the underlying prices that were used in this analysis from the wholesale market. And those were mostly about whether or not we included things like scarcity pricing when the system was short on operating reserves, or other reserve requirements. And so I'm going to go ahead and answer this one, but in the analysis, we did have sort of a future of 2030 that had a particular planning reserve margin requirement, and then we would build out portfolios of resources that could make sure that you could meet that planning reserve requirement. And in times where you had situations where the generation might be scarce and you start kind of running out of that, then prices would go up. And in particular, in the ERCOT, we had that ORDC pricing where we did see price spikes that occurred a few times. And we also did include operating reserve requirements and other ancillary service requirements in that simulation so that we could reflect those wholesale prices the best we could. It did end up in a situation where not all of the generation that was required to meet that planning reserve margin was able to completely cover its costs with the energy prices. And so that resulted in these capacity prices. And in the results that we've shown today, what we did was we allocated those capacity costs onto some of the top net load hours. So we allocated that to the top 100 net load hours so that those were embedded in our energy prices. So we effectively have sort of an energy and capacity price that was the foundation for this. So let me go on to the second question. This is for Yo. It was just a question about whether or not the energy efficiency savings that you were showing depended on season as well as the time of day, and how did that sort of any seasonal change? How did that affect the energy efficiency value calculations?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So I think this is a good opportunity to just, in general, re-emphasize the method that we used here. We try to use as much as possible high-resolution load shape information, which we then couple with high-resolution electricity prices. So we don't just use average electricity prices, but really try to use our hourly electricity prices and hourly load shapes. Now, we had difficulty presenting to you 8,760 values that would just make these slides quite cluttered. So for presentation purposes, we then averaged it for a single value over the course of the year. But that single value, the average value for that year, encompasses both periods of low value and low electricity prices and low energy demand due to, I don't know, mild winters or not so hot summers. So there are differences between the seasons for the energy efficiency performance. But that should be captured in the underlying load shapes, especially for HVAC. HVAC, we had our strategic locations in the different ISOs, and those relied on TMOI3 weather data, and that then captures climatic differences and differences from like 1 hour and 1 day to the next day. So there are seasonal differences included here. But over the long term, you were not really interested in the performance in just one season, but really the performance over the lifetime of that asset. And so we thought that an annual average value here could be a good proxy for that longer term performance over the lifetime of the asset. Now, again, we only focus on 1 year, 2030, and in reality, the overall electric system will evolve further beyond that 1 year, right? And so the value proposition in the year 2040 or so may be a little different from the one in 2030 that we described today.
Thanks, Yo. And there's a couple more questions that would be nice to get to, so we'll try to do these pretty fast. One of them was just about whether we included any assumptions about storage in the future. And I want to reiterate that what we did was just only include any sort of existing storage or mandates that required certain amounts of storage. We didn't look to interconnection queues to see sort of forecasts of future amounts. And so this is a question now for Cody, is that you had a number of conclusions for the hydrogen production. Which of those might be affected by growth in low-cost storage? How sensitive might some of your conclusions be to that low-cost storage?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I mean, to the extent that there's more available storage than you'd expect to have a more moderate price profile, and so that some of these results certainly would be sensitive. And in terms of some of the other analysis we look at, where we look at desalinated water as an opportunity to use product storage in place of electricity storage, I mean, that would certainly be sensitive to that result. But I think in general, we would still expect higher price volatility even with some of that storage. So I think the broad conclusions are still important.
Okay. And then staying with Cody here, so could you just say a couple of them combined here? What was the price elasticity that you assumed? And does it vary depending on whether or not a consumer is responding to a TOU versus sort of just sort of underlying like that? Do we have sort of assumptions about how customer sensitivity to TOU rates?
Yeah, this is a great question to ask, and so we used an elasticity of 0.05 for the time of use rates, and then during the critical peak pricing events, we used an elasticity of 0.1, so a higher elasticity, assuming that customers are more responsive during these kind of short duration, critical peak events. But I'd also emphasize that our choice of the elasticity, we use the same elasticity in all of our low VRE and high VRE scenarios. So the general directions of kind of the changes we see would still hold up no matter what elasticity we use. It would just be the magnitude of the deadweight loss would change, but not the direction. And there's a lot more in our report about some of the studies we look to when we use our elasticity assumptions.
We'll try to get to two last questions here. So staying on the rate design, could you just say quickly something about your design of the critical peak pricing programs? What were the number of events, sort of the definition of the CPP periods, and how did you choose the height of it? And then I guess related to that, why didn't we see real-time pricing as one of the rate design options?
So with regards to the CPP, one of the conclusions I wasn't able to get to today, but I think is a really interesting one, is that we do allow, one of the parameters we vary is the number of critical peak pricing events to be called during the year. And we found in the low VRE scenario, it was about 20 critical peak pricing events would produce the lowest deadweight loss. And that's somewhat similar to current CPP programs offered today. But in the high VRE scenarios, we saw that I think in the case of ERCOT, which was the most dramatic in the high solar scenario, the optimal number of CPP event days went up to something like 40 event days, which is considerably higher. So I agree with that question that mentioned that talked about the importance of the number of CPP event days, and we do find that you would need to expand the use of CPP event days in high VRE features. And I guess quickly, why we didn't look at real-time pricing, I think there's a lot of studies already out there on how real-time pricing is the most efficient rate structure. And I think we did have to limit the number of rate structures we wanted to analyze. And I think we kind of chose this CPP, combined with time of use as our rate structure to analyze, because Real-time pricing is really complicated for customers to understand, and we think a lot of the benefits of real-time pricing can be met with TOU 3 period with CPP.
Okay, thank you so much for those answers. We didn't get to all of the questions, and we will try to follow up with folks afterwards via email. And did just want to thank everybody for joining today. This has been a great discussion, and we appreciate your participation in this. And we look forward to having you at future webinars, and similarly to any additional conversations that stem from this presentation. So thank you all, and have a good day.